All right, everyone, let's go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome. My name is Jordan Straley, and I am the Marketing and Communications Manager here at NEHA. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the NEHA Election Impact webinar today. This webinar will be recorded and available on our website after the webinar. Please drop any questions you have into the chat. I'll keep an eye on those and we'll open it up at the end for Q&A. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to NEHA's Director of Government Affairs, Doug Farquhar. Take it away, Doug.
Jordan, thank you very much. I appreciate speaking with everyone this afternoon. It was a very eventful midterms this year, with the basic premise that we were going to see a huge red tide. It did not occur. The Democrats ended up overperforming in almost every sector that they could. So it ended up providing us a different scenario for going into the 118th Congress and to legislative sessions starting in January than we had originally expected. To kind of give you a breakdown of the overview of what occurred, and there we go. Some of this will sound familiar, but I want you to understand where we kind of are sitting right now. As you know, the Democrats retain the control of the Senate by securing 50 seats. The Republicans have 49 seats at this point. They may gain a seat with the election in Georgia on December 6th if Herschel Walker wins. Or if the Democrats can add an extra seat with Raphael Warnock winning. But either way, the Democrats retain control of the Senate by securing those 50 seats. Republicans have gained control of the House. They secured at least 222 seats at this point. They may gain another seat or two, but they clearly came in with at least 7 to possibly 9 extra seats to allow them to take control. Now, the reason that is telling is because had the Republicans come in with a strong showing, meaning winning 20 to 30 to 40 seats, as were predicted, they would have had a lot more opportunity to push back against Democrat requests for additional funding for climate change, for additional funding for the infrastructure package, for additional activities in the appropriations language, which has not been finalized yet. But because they came in with such a tight win, that's probably going to mean, or that will mean, that the Republican leadership will have to negotiate with the Democrats to make sure they have enough votes to pass the budget. The fiscal year 23 budget has not been passed yet. It's gone through markup, it's gone out of committee, but the final tally has not been, the final bill has not been adopted. What that means is that we are operating under continuing resolutions, and that our current resolution is going to go until mid-December. At that point, congressional leadership is going to have to make a determination. Is it in their best interest to simply put the fiscal year 23 appropriations to bed, to come to an agreement, not to quibble over the different budget amounts, so the 118th Congress can begin with a clean slate? Or is it going to be worth their while to hold off, not come to an agreement, and wait for the 118th Congress to come in? Had the Republicans won by 20, 30, 40 seats, that would definitely have been their interest, to hold off, not to come to any conclusions, and wait for the next Congress to make decisions on the budget. They don't really have that luxury at this point. They don't have a strong majority. They just have a very narrow majority, which can be disrupted by any number of people in their own party. And as you've heard, there's much concern about far right, the Tea Party, people who were supporters of former President Trump. those members, they may not go along with what Republican leadership wants to do. And so if they do not secure and do not finish the budget by the time the next Congress sits, they could have a lot of trouble trying to get the fiscal year 23 budget finalized. So with that in mind, there's probably a lot of interest for the current party leadership on both the Democratic and Republican side to come forward and come to an agreement and not quibble, not argue over the fiscal year 23 budget, and wait to see how the 118th Congress comes and wants to address the fiscal year 24 budget, and they're able to go forward with a clean slate. A couple of things I want to highlight regarding the election in Congress. One thing is that we saw less people vote in the 2022 Congress than we did in 2020 or in 2018. We did not see the huge groundswell that we had seen in those two election cycles. Certain battleground states, however, did see an increase. Pennsylvania had a 4-point increase over 2020 of voter turnout. Michigan and Wisconsin, they saw turnout reach 60%. Arizona also saw a huge turnout. Georgia, those numbers came in as if they were doing if the presidential race was on the ballot. It wasn't, but there was an enormous amount of interest. On the other hand, we saw some states where they didn't see a very active turnout. Maryland, New Jersey, in those states, turnout dropped 10 points. In West Virginia and in Mississippi, turnout was as low as 35%. It was a very, very low turnout election in those states. So there wasn't a lot of enthusiasm in many states to get out and come and vote, as we had seen in 2018 or 2022 or 2020. This was, in the end, about 46% of the nation overall voted in the midterms. This was less than the 66% we saw in 2020, or even the 50% we saw in 2018. Regarding environmental health on the committees, we are going to see some changes there. One, because the Republicans took over the House, that means the chairs are going to switch from Democrat to Republican. Another thing is in the Senate, many of the longtime Senate appropriators, such as Richard Shelby from Alabama, Pat Leahy from Vermont, they are leaving. So we're going to have a new slate of folks. In House, the House Appropriations, we will probably see Kay Granger from Texas as the chair of that committee. Rosa DeLauro from Connecticut will continue in her role as the Democratic chair, which is minority chair now. For Labor HHS subcommittee, we probably are going to see Representative Tom Cole from Oklahoma chair that committee. Ways and Means in the House, it's going to be a toss-up. Is it going to be Vern Buchanan from Florida or Adrian Smith from Nebraska? A third possibility may be Jason Smith from Missouri. So there's a lot of competition going on right now. Who's going to be in charge of Ways and Means? Democrat side, the minority chair will remain Representative Richard Neal from Massachusetts. In Senate, the Senate appropriation, it is as I mentioned, it will not be going to Senator Shelby. It's going to be going to Senator Susan Collins from Maine. The minority chair will remain the same within Senator Patty Murray from Washington. However, there are rumors that she may move up in the Senate hierarchy. And if that happens, she may hold off on her role as Senate chair of appropriations. We don't know. She will have that opportunity. Senate chair of Senate appropriations is incredibly powerful. It's something you don't ever normally give up, but we could see some new activity this time around. The Senate Subcommittee on Labor, HHS, we really don't know who's going to be chairing on that, but the Senate Health Committee, Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, Bernie Sanders is slated to be the chair of that one. And for the minority, it's either going to be Rand Paul of Kentucky or Bill Cassidy of Louisiana. And the Senate Budget Committee looks like it's going to be Sheldon Whitehouse from Rhode Island, and Chuck Grassley from Iowa will be the minority chair. Now, as we were talking about, the budget is going to be the key issue that is going to be coming up for the Congress. Now, they can't do, the Republicans, even though they took over the House, they can't do much about the big bills that were enacted during the 117th Congress. The Inflation Reduction Act, the infrastructure bill, things to promote climate change. They aren't in a position to repeal those laws, because even if they did, they'd have to get the Senate to sign on. And even if the Senate signed on, they'd have to get the president to agree not to veto it. They just don't have that ability. So they're not going to be able to do much with the bills that have already been passed. But what they can do is change the budget, alter the budget for those provisions. One of the things that we've seen Representative Buddy Carter do from Georgia, he might be the next chairman of the House Budget Committee. He introduced a bill to divert all funding, unspent pandemic funding, to go towards the deficit, which means money that was going to be available for public health if he was trying to get that moved over to deal with the deficit. Other things along those lines could occur, where they take where the Republican majority may take unspent dollars or dollars that are being underutilized and use it for other things. So taking it from the pandemic, moving it over to deal with the deficit, taking it from the infrastructure and climate change, move it over to deal with the deficit. These are all things that we are keeping our eye on, that we want to be very diligent about, and make sure that none of that the funding that has been appropriated for public health remains there. The states, and as you all know, that's my favorite area. The states is where we've seen most activities occur when it comes to policy implementation for environmental health. That's where we're seeing activities occur on climate change. That's where we're seeing activities occur on food safety, on body art, on water, on wastewater. That's all occurring in the state level. And as everybody knows, the money is not at the states, it's at the federal. So it's been very important when we start seeing all these bills passed, like the infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act, to see how all this money from the federal level being given to the states to allow them to direct where the money is going to go. Now, this money is supposed to go for infrastructure, but as we have seen, sometimes the states reallocate it for different purposes. Technically, they're not allowed to do that, but as we know, they get away with it far too often. What's the makeup of the state legislatures? Of the 99 chambers out there, and that's because every state has 2 chambers with the exception of Nebraska, 57 of them are being controlled by the Republicans. 39 are being controlled by the Democrats. Of the 7,286 seats, about 2/3 of them, over 6,000, were up, 6,279 were up for election this year. Of those, we saw elections occur in 46 states. Only New Jersey, Virginia, and Louisiana, and one other did not have elections for legislative seats in 2022. We also saw 36 governor races and 133 statewide ballot initiatives. Overall, of the total number of seats that were up for election, the 6,279, Republicans won 40 more seats than Democrats. That is not a good result for any time you have a party where the president is the opposite party. You generally see huge wins. 200, 300 seats go towards your way. Republicans only won 40 seats. That's the lowest number we have seen since the 1930s. The only other time that we did not see this trend occur was one after 9/11. George Bush, he brought in a lot of well, he wasn't on the election, but for the 2002 election, a lot of people came around and voted for Republicans. So that it was an anomaly. The other anomaly was in 1934, when it was FDR's first midterm, and he did very well during that. But every other race since 1934, the party in power, the party that controlled the presidency, lost seats dramatically during the legislative session, during the legislative elections. But like I said, this year, the Republicans didn't do that well. They only gained 40 seats. That allowed the Democrats to flip chambers in Minnesota, Michigan, Pennsylvania. And in the Alaska, the Senate's interesting, even though the majority of senators are Republican, a coalition of 8 Republicans and 9 Democrats are working together to form a coalition where they're going to be in charge of everything. They're going to split control, and that's going to leave 3 far-right Republicans in the minority, essentially. They would not have any say in this. Another thing that's really interesting is the Republican trifecta. In 22 states, the Republicans control both the House, they control the Senate, and they control the governorship. And in 16 of those, that governorship or the legislative wins are so high that it makes them veto-proof. This means that in 16 states, the Republicans simply dominate. On the other hand, we've seen 17 states with the Democrat trifecta. They control the House, the Senate, and the governor. And in 11 of those states, it has become veto-proof. The amount of seats that the Democrats control are so high that it's basically the Republicans have almost no say in there. And for comparison, the Russian Duma has 5 parties that contribute to it. The Duma has they have a One World Party member. So even under communist Russia, there's more diversity in the Duma than we do see in 39 of our 50 states. Only 10 states have a split control, and then the final state would be Nebraska, which is nonpartisan. It shows you on how firmly entrenched we are with either being a D or an R. What that means is in states, you're going to have to work with that. If you want to get anything passed for environmental health, you're going to have to work under the auspices of a democratically controlled government or a Republican controlled government. And the messages you send to each are different. And that's something that I think everybody should be aware of and understand. This is possibly the highest numbers of trifectas that we have seen. We rarely, in the past, we used to see basically no more than 10 states that were really strongly entrenched one way or the other. The trend's going the opposite way. Ever since 2010, more and more states are voting single party line. They're either Democrats or Republicans. We're not seeing a lot of diversity go on out there. Okay, what's that going to mean for us in Congress regarding the budget? Well, I've highlighted the numbers in front of you here. about how much each one of the major agencies that deal with environmental health are going to receive. And then I also included defense. The reason I do that is basically the way Congress looks at the budget. There's two budgets that they look at: the defense budget and the non-defense budget. So agriculture, energy, homeland security, interior, labor, HHS, transportation, all that is considered non-defense. So it gets put up against how much they have for defense. Generally, what they try to do is equalize the two. Defense will come up with a certain amount, and then everybody else is going to have to add up to meet that amount. And then they quibble over billions that either go towards defense or goes towards non-defense spending. What we're looking at right here is the budget for some of the major ones. When you talk about agriculture, huge amount goes out for food stamps and SNAP. And it's actually one of the top 5 budgets, and I'm sure most of you would not expect agriculture to be, but the agriculture budget is significant. And so any money that they get for FSIS and food safety is going to be very important. It's going to be very important to those Congress people who control that budget. Energy and water, that one we're seeing possibly 56 to 57 billion being available. Homeland security, between 59 and 60. Interior and EPA, 44 billion to 42 to 44 billion. Labor, HHS, which as you can see is second only to defense. It is in a huge budget. It's between 216 billion to 224 billion. And transportation and HUD, that's either 89 or 90 billion. For us, the key one is going to be labor, HHS, that 216 to 224, because that budget covers CDC, covers Institutes of Health, covers NIEHS, it covers NIOSH, it covers all the issues that are important to us. It does not cover food safety. FDA is covered under the agricultural budget. So FDA has a little bit easier time of getting their budgets through because of the interest and the support that the ag community gives to pushing these budgets through. So that's one of those things you have to kind of keep in the back of your mind regarding when you go forward with budgets. Homeland, 118th Congress to address climate change. Several different areas are getting money. Homeland security. The Senate bill would take $2 billion of unspent disaster relief funding and divert it to climate change mitigation programs, which Republicans has considered would transform FEMA's pre-disaster mitigation program into a climate change fund. If you understand FEMA, basically when there's a disaster, FEMA comes in and dumps an enormous amount of money out there. What they are trying to do is have a preventive and mitigation effort, and they've already passed this legislation, Congress has, to require FEMA to start rewarding states for doing mitigation, for making it less likely that they will have a disaster. So in Florida, hurricane mitigation operations. In North Carolina, putting up berms along the Outer Bank Islands. California, mitigation purposes for wildfires. If you do this, this is something that they are supposed to reward the states with. This policy is turning into a climate change mitigation, meaning Democrats are using this language to say, okay, mitigation activities, if they deal with climate change, then you're going to be, then the state would be able to access this money. Interior environment, the Civilian Climate Change Corps. In both the House and the Senate in fiscal year 23, they have money available to direct funding to the Park Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, BLM, and Bureau of Indian Affairs to support a Civilian Climate Change Corps, much like the Civilian Conservation Corps of the 1930s. The current Congress is looking at reinvesting in that and creating that again. State, the Foreign Affairs Green Climate Fund. House and Senate Democrats propose setting by a $1.6 billion for the U.S. contribution for multilateral Green Climate Fund. Now, the Senate Republicans are not in support of that. They criticized it as a global climate slush fund that lacks sufficient oversight, transparency, and governance. However, this is the direction that the current Congress would like to go for fiscal year 23. It probably will get thrown. Some of these debates are going to get thrown over into the 118th Congress, where the Democrats won't have as much authority, but the Republicans don't either. So they're going to have to figure out a compromise and how far, both sides are going to have to realize how far they want to push this and support this. Other things we're seeing that may come out of the 118th, they may repeal the tax credits for electric vehicles. That is highly likely to occur. And and as we talked about before, Buddy Carter would like to move $100 million of the pandemic aid to reduce the national debt. The FDA budget. FDA, as I said, is in an interesting position because it's attached to the ag budget. Most ag Congress people, they're bipartisan. Of all the budgets, of all the non-defense budget, this one probably has the most support from the Republican Party. But that's for the ag side. It's not necessarily for the food safety side. Food safety side is put in there. And, most of Congress does not realize it's there, or they don't pay as much attention to it until this year. This year, FDA managed to upset both the Republicans and the Democrats regarding food safety. There's a lot of questioning from people like Tom Cole on the Republican side, Andy Harris on the Republican side, Rosa DeLauro on the Democratic side, people coming together saying, hey, FDA, you're not doing food safety effectively. And even though they're getting a 10% increase from the House, neither the House nor the Senate, nor the Republicans, nor the Democrats have been very happy with what's going on. And they have called FDA Commissioner Robert Califf to speak on this more than once. That has also led to the Reagan-Udall Foundation's review of the FDA approach. And it's going to be very interesting to hear what they come up with. Their report is due shortly in early December. And so far, there's been a lot of interest from both parties to adopt what they come up with. Even though we're not too sure about what they came up with, they both were wanting to have the Reagan-Udall Foundation take a look at this. So it could be a kind of a tumultuous year for the FDA and their budget, but we're also still in the wait and see mode. This is what we're looking at right now for center operations, almost 400 million, almost 800 million for the field operations. That means that it gets broken down from there. So there's a lot of support. How do I want to put it? There's a lot of money out there for FDA for food safety, for medical, several aspects of it. On the one hand, on the other hand, Congress is very upset with the agency. So we'll have to see how this thing plays out. CDC budget. was at 8.4 billion. Congress wants to push it up to 10.5 billion. Or let's put it this way, language from the House is saying that. And that includes 75 million for climate change, which is a $65 million increase from last year. If you remember the fiscal year 22 budget, Congress actually had 100 million for CDC to deal with climate change. It wasn't until the last final week of the negotiations that Congress pulled that money out, and they went back to reiterated to a zero increase. This year, the House is asking for a $65 million increase to give them $75 million total for climate change. And that's going to be by far the most significant budget increase for CDC's National Center for Environmental Health. So we're really got our fingers crossed, and we are pushing, and we are sending letters to Congress to advocate that they do keep the budget line item at 75 million for climate change. Couple of things. As I talked about earlier, the states is where the policies occur. CDC cannot get their projects done without states implementing them. FDA cannot get their food safety program implemented without state operations making them occur. It leads to a lot of passing of money. It leads to contracts, FDA contracts with the states to perform food safety. It leads to CDC coming up with cooperative agreements to encourage states and to fund their programs that they want to see happen, such as climate change, tracking, food traceability, things along those lines, all must be done by the states. Biomonitoring is another program that's almost entirely funded by the CDC. However, with all these programs, if you get federal money, you have to do what the federal government says. Some of these states want to go a different direction, which means they'll have to come up with their own money. For biomonitoring, 2 states, California and Minnesota, actually fund their own programs, which gives them control over how those activities will occur. In New York, they passed a ballot initiative to address climate change. This $4.2 billion measure means that the New York State is going to provide $500 million to electrify school buses, $400 million for green building projects, $1.1 billion for restoration and flood risk reduction and rehabilitation and shoreline restoration projects, $650 for open space, land conservation, and another $650 for water quality improvement and resilient infrastructure, which all of this will help the environmental health community. The final state that moved forward was Rhode Island. Rhode Island passed a similar bill, even though it was much less than what New York came up with. New York, they came up with a $50 million bond for environmental and recreational purposes. For environmental, 66%, for recreational, 32% of that $50 million. 16 million of it is going to improve resiliency of infrastructure, vulnerable coastal habitats, restore rivers and stream floodplains to make sure that these areas have been mitigated for any natural disasters or climate change or any sort of natural disasters that are related to climate change. This is also going to include a $12 million construction for a state-of-the-art carbon neutral education center at the Roger Williams Park and Zoo. So there's an enormous amount of investments that are going on in Rhode Island and New York on climate change. This is in addition to the work that's already being done in California. So that provides a real quick overview of what we are seeing right now in Congress from the midterms. As I said, the big takeaways are the Democrats overperformed. The Republicans did win the House, but by a small margin that is going to force them to negotiate with the Democrats on the budgets, that activities that were adopted that were favorable to environmental health during the 117th Congress will stay in effect. But the 118th Congress may have the opportunity, well, they'll have the opportunity, but they may try to implement be less generous with funding for these programs than the 117th. And in the states, we are seeing one-party systems. Either you're probably going to be dealing with Republicans or Democrats, but no matter which state you go into and what's the makeup of the state, they still need to address the problem. So if you have a problem on climate change, on wastewater, on PFAS, on drinking water, on food safety, it does not matter if it's a D or an R state you're dealing with. They're going to have to come up with a solution. They're going to have to deal with something. This is something they do not have the luxury of ignoring problems. That's something we see time and time again at Congress. They will push things off for years down the road and they won't get things done. Whereas in the states, they have to get things done. I think the foremost thing that the 117th Congress did was name post offices. That was the biggest thing they did overall for the country. In the states, they had to deal with body art. They had to deal with climate change. They had to deal with disaster relief. They had to deal with PFAS. They had to deal with water systems. These are problems that aren't going away and they're going to have to get addressed, and they will be addressed with or without congressional support. With that, Jordan, do we love to take some questions if anybody has anything that they're curious about?
Thank you, Doug. I don't see any questions in the chat right now, but I'll give folks a few minutes to get those in there. And I do have a question for you. Why do you think voter turnout was lower in some of those states this year?
There wasn't a lot of, there wasn't big races. There wasn't a sensational race like you saw with the presidency or with the Senate in Pennsylvania and in Georgia. So it just led to less interest. On the other hand, to me, those are the important races. You know, it's the down ballot races, the ones you don't hear about. It's your state legislator, your county commissioner, your coroner, your mayor. Mm-hmm. These are the ones that are really going to affect your day-to-day lives. Right. And they're the ones that are going to make the big changes. We saw a lot of county commissioners come forward and reject a lot of the CDC recommendations for the pandemic. They had that ability because they were elected by the public to do that. Even though CDC made these recommendations and they were pushed at the federal level or at the national level, many of these local county commissioners that we voted in refused to allow their county to implement that.
Interesting. All right. Are there policy issues that R's and D's can agree on? Can we do a case study on how to navigate policy issues where there is a consensus on action?
Yes. And I'm trying to figure out the best way because that's a big question.
That's a big question.
But, you know, when you start looking at things that, as I said, they have to get done. Lead service lines, water service lines. This is not something that you can say, well, you know, we're just not going to do anything about it. You have to do something about it. It's something in your job description. One of the things I found positive is when working with the Wisconsin Republican Party in the Republican legislatures regarding lead service line replacement, they came forward and they came up with a system that they said, look, we can't accept what the Democrats are coming forward with, but this is what we can accept. This is what we can do. We can get, we can get opportunities out there for local governments to get funding to replace lead service lines. We're not going to require it. We're not going to make it mandatory, but this is something that we would feel comfortable with. And the way they couched it was a conservative approach to environmental health. There are conservative approaches to environmental health. Mind you, we have 47 states that have adopted cannabis, which means Mississippi, Alabama, some very dark, deep red states have figured out a way to allow for cannabis policy, allow for the public to get access to cannabis, which, as many of you realize, 10 years ago was unfathomable. So I do think that if the issue, if it's couched in a way that is not defined as imposing a mandate on anybody, being negative towards industry for small business, you will have much more opportunity for more conservative members to adopt those positions. When we got activities out there regarding food and food safety, you know, you have to realize that in Maine, it was the Democrats that adopted the food freedom provisions, and it was the Republican governor that vetoed it. So there's no natural, easy answer to these positions. But what I've seen is when a problem is put forward, that you can come up with an answer. You can come up with an answer that's going to satisfy both liberal interests and conservative interests at the state level. I am not going to say that it's going to occur at the federal level because they're too locked up in their parties.
Right.
But at the state level, very much so.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. It doesn't look like we have any other questions, so I guess we can wrap it up a touch early unless you have any closing remarks.
Those were kind of the major issues I wanted to cover. We have a wealth of information and wealth of activities that are going on at NEHA regarding government affairs. As I mentioned, the budgets are going to be finalized for fiscal year 23. NEHA has already sent several letters outlining our request for environmental health for appropriations. We are sending letters regarding the environmental health workforce language that it should be attached to the appropriations bill. So we are keeping things quite active. Look forward to hearing from you. Any activities that are going on in your state that we can help with, or you just want to share, I'll be more than happy to hear and more than happy to listen.
Wonderful. Thank you, Doug. And I just wanted to remind everyone that this was recorded and it should be available up on the NEHA website in not too long, a couple of days, as soon as we can. Thanks, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jordan.
Thank you. Bye.